going to talk to us on the subject, how can youth cope with today's crisis? Let's give our attention to Brother Dorsey.
I would like for you to imagine that you are visiting a very sick youth in the hospital, and he's in the intensive care unit. And I'm sure that you can recall in the past that there's a very serious atmosphere in those intensive care units. You have all of your hospital personnel there running backwards and forth and taking vital signs, heart rates, blood counts, and putting them on little clipboards, or in some cases might even putting them into a computer program or process there. Now in this case, while you're visiting there, the doctors call all of the family along with you into one of those little small conference rooms, and that's just enough to stop your heart from beating right there when they call you in there. And they get you inside, and they say, medically speaking, we have did everything that we can do for this young person. They have reached the point where things can either make a turn for the better or they can make a turn for the worse. Now, when you think about a situation such as this, I'm sure that many terms comes to mind that you could define it with, but one that comes to mind is that this is a crisis. And that's what a crisis is. It's a point where things can either turn for the better or the worse. Now, our young people today face such a situation. They face a crisis in their lives that could be compared to that of a very, very sick person. Yes, they are living in, these are critical times that we are living in. Now, this crisis is reflected by drugs, suicide, sexual immorality, sexually transmitted diseases, violence, crime. The list just goes on and on. And to support this point, I took the time to take some articles from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, maybe a couple of weeks back. Now, here's some articles from that newspaper. It says that, one, I made a stupid mistake, boy says, of teacher's death. 14-year-old takes stand in Florida. Ridgeville, South Carolina. The mother of a 6-month-old boy who said her child was abducted, shot, and thrown into a canal was charged Friday with murdering him, authorities said. So many children are being prostituted in Atlanta that police are creating a special unit to identify child victims and build cases against the adult exploiting them. Girl, ex-principal found in Vegas. 11-year-old thinks she's in love. Man, 28, arrested. Doraville police question teens in death of three-year-old girl. Drug flap led to teen shooting. 2 teenagers were shot after an argument about marijuana in southeast Atlanta Friday afternoon. Both males were in critical condition in Grady Memorial Hospital. Here's another article. I took this one out of the newspaper a few years back, but it makes a point. It says the tightly knit gang of extremely violent Jamaican drug dealers that are perplexing police in the nation's capital have begun operating out of some poor neighborhoods in Atlanta, authorities said Thursday. The Jamaicans are recruiting kids 14, 15, and 16 years old to sell drugs for them, said Atlanta Police Lieutenant Smith, head of the Youth Crime Squad in the Special Investigation Section. Notice what he said. He said, I met a kid last week. He said, I make $5,000 a week as a lookout. Why should I do anything else? Now just think, you do the math. How much do they pay at McDonald's? $7, $8 an hour? Now, why would a kid, 13, 14, 15 years old, want to work at McDonald's $8 an hour when he can make $5,000 a week as a lookout for drug dealers? Now, granted, if we took these out of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and you live out here, so you might not face, or your youth might not face some of the problems, but wherever we are, we'll have to admit that such situations as this contribute to that crisis that all youth are confronted with. The amazing thing, though, is that I was able to take these articles out of the newspaper within 1 week. Didn't have to look hard for them. So I'm sure that all of us will agree that our young people's future is in danger. So the question is, how can they ensure a happy future? Well, before we try to answer that question, let us address this question, and that is, why does this crisis exist today? Well, one reason is a breakdown of family life. That's a major factor in the crisis. The University of Michigan Institute for Social Research found that working mothers spend an average of 11 minutes daily of quality time. Now, quality time is defined as exclusive playing or teaching with your children. During the week, that's weekdays, and about 30 minutes per day on weekends. And us fathers, we're not doing any better. It says fathers spend about 8 minutes of quality time with their kids on weekdays and 14 minutes on weekends. Non-working mothers spend 13 minutes per day of quality time with their children. So you see, we're so busy we don't have time to spend with our children. And this is contributing to the crisis that they are confronted with. Another reason is that parents may lack strong moral convictions. You see, that kids get very little discipline or sound direction. In some cases, we are confusing our children. Let's say, for example, that there's a small child here in the Kingdom Hall during the meeting that begins to cry or something. What's the parents going to do? Well, they're going to take the child up and take them off to the restroom. Once the child is in the restroom, they take out this little bag. And inside the bag, what do you have? Well, you have the child's favorite juice in the little bottle there. You have some cookies and a toy, a rubber ducky, we'll say. Take all three of these out, give them to the child. What will the child do? Stop crying, you see. Well, as soon as the child gets settled down, stops crying, the parent will do what? Take the ducky back in the bag, the cookies and the juice, put them back in the bag, pick the child up, bring him back into the auditorium, and expect that child to sit there and listen to me. That's not reasonable, you see. You see, when that child goes off to the bathroom or wherever, that's not supposed to be a pleasant experience for him. And then when he comes back in, he will enjoy listening to me. You see. Yes, children need sound direction in their lives. Another problem is that normal childhood has often been lost because of parents spoiling their children. You see, when I came along, within my generation, we only had some of the things we needed. But today, children have everything that they need and all of the things that they want. What happens when we give our children, our youth, everything they want? We spoil them. The Bible tells us this at Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 21. Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 21 says this: if one is pampering one's servant from youth on, in his later life, he will even become a thankless one. Yes, a spoiled one. That's what happens when we give our young people all of the things they want. Much of today's educational environment is devoid of moralities and ethics. You see, many equate success with material possession or social position. Sexual immorality and homosexuality, they are accepted in society today. The worldly figures promote or even flaunt immorality, show disrespect for authority and the traditional standards that we all once knew about. And then, of course, there's television and the movies. This is a large influence and a big factor in today's crisis. You see, much of what some would refer to as being entertainment glamorizes violence, sex, and indifference to suffering. It's been estimated that by the time a child reaches the age of 18, he has watched thousands of murders, rapes, and crimes. Now, some might reason, well, they're acting. Well, of course they're acting. But how many has ever watched a movie or a TV program and cried about it? Well, I'm sure none of the brothers did. They wouldn't admit it anyway. But I'm sure that you have to realize that these actors are able to influence us in such a way through their actions. So to the point of crying or almost crying or feeling sorry for perhaps one of the individuals within the movie. Now, if it does that to us as adults, then what do these same movies of crime, violence, and sex do to our young people? Now, of course, they do have a system of rating these movies. They have, I think it's PG-13, that's a new one. And then, of course, they have R-rated movies. Now, should we use this as a guide to determine which movies that we would consider as entertainment? Ask yourself this question: who labels or who rates these movies? Is it not Satan's system? They're the one rating these movies. So when our children view such movies, such entertainment, it has a sense of, they get to the point that they can't really appreciate right and wrong. They are brutalized. Their sensitivity is lowered. So what do? Well, needless to say, all of this is part of that crisis that our children are confronted with. Then, of course, we have poverty, hopelessness, desperation. All of these are contributing factors. But the fundamental reason for the crisis are given in the Bible. Yes, brothers, we are living in the last days of this system of things. The Bible speaks of this time period, this generation that we are now living in. The Apostle Paul also speaks of a point, and of course he too mentioned in the last days at 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1 through 5. This is a scripture that we are very familiar with, but we'll consider it in part. There at 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, Paul says this: "But know this, that in the last days, critical times hard to deal with will be here." He goes on to talk about how for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, self-assuming, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, disloyal. Move down to verse 5. It says, "Have a form of godly devotion, but proven false to its power. And from these turn away." What is Paul talking about when he says that these will have a form of godly devotion, but proven false to its power? Turn over to Titus, chapter 1, verse 16. I think Paul, in writing to Titus, kind of gives us a little bit of insight into what he was saying there. He says there in Titus chapter 1 and verse 16, it says, "They publicly declare they know God." Yes, they have a form of godly devotion, but they disown him by their works, because they are detestable and disobedient and not approved for good works of any sort. Yes, they publicly say that they know God, but their actions prove that they don't. It's to say there is no godly devotion. And when there is no godly devotion, there is no fear of Jehovah. And if there is no fear of Jehovah, then there is no obedience. There's only disobedience. All of this contributes to the crisis that our youth are confronted with today. I'm sure we'll have to all agree with that. So the question now is, how can our youth cope with this crisis? Number one, parents. We play a very important role. You see, parental example and training will help youth cope with the crisis. Parental example and training will help our youth. To be effective, parental example must be consistent with Christian teachings. And you notice we said Christian teachings, because sometimes parental teachings don't necessarily have to be Christian teachings. Now, we bring our children to the Kingdom Hall, and they receive Christian teachings from the platform. They receive such things as, or they hear such things as 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, which tells us to always to have plenty to do in the work of the Lord. Luke chapter 13, verse 24 tells us to exert ourselves to get in through the narrow gate. Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, we're all familiar with, which tells us about the preaching of the good news. These are Christian teachings. Now, parents, as our example consistent with these teachings? You see, if our example is not consistent with these Christian teachings, then we're not helping our youth to cope with with today's crisis. You see, parents should demonstrate to their children that love for God is the foremost thing in their lives. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, 6, and 7 makes a very good point as to how we can do this. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, 6, and 7. Notice here, this, of course, is Jehovah speaking, and he's talking in the first, well, all three verses, but specifically here in verse 5 and 6, he's talking about the parents and telling them something that they must do. It says, "And you must love Jehovah your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your vital forces. And these words, these Christian teachings that I am commanding you today must prove to be on your heart." And then after they are on your heart, or our heart as parents, the further instruction in verse 7 is, "And you must inculcate them in your son, and speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk on the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up." Yes, we have to help ourselves, and then we'll be in a position to help our children. It's like when you're taking an airplane trip. One of the stewardess or airplane personnel will come out and they will give you offer some instructions. And they will perhaps say that if we have any problems, there will be air masks that will drop out of the ceiling of the plane or perhaps from a console in the center of the seats. Now, if you're riding along with your child and there's a problem there and you think that we need the air mask, what would be the first reaction? Would it not be, as a parent, to take that air mask and perhaps put it on the child? Well, the airline stewardess will say, no, that's not what you do. You see, when the problem comes about and that air mask drops down, you take it first and put it on your face. And then you will what? Be in a position to help your child. Same thing Moses is saying there in principle, you see. Before you can help your child, have to help yourself. Has to be on your heart, and then you can impart that information to your child. We have to demonstrate that to our children. You know, young Timothy's grandmother and mother, they demonstrated that to young Timothy. Lois and Eunice, you recall them in the Bible. Notice what Paul says to young Timothy about them in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. Paul says there, "For I recollect the faith which is in you without any hypocrisy." Why was Paul able to say that? Notice here, he says, "And which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, but which I am confident is also in you." Yes, Paul was confident that the same faith that Lois and Eunice had, young Timothy would have. Now, how did Lois and Eunice impart such faith to young Timothy? Well, turn over a few pages there to 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 14. One page, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 14. It says, "You, however, continue in the things that you learned and were persuaded to believe." Now, when we think of persuasion, we think of perhaps strong argument, but Timothy was persuaded to believe these Christian teachings, as the part B of that same verse saying, knowing from what persons you learned them. Yes, they persuaded young Timothy by their example. That's why Paul said, knowing from what persons you learned them. Yes, on Saturday morning, where was young Timothy? Well, he was in field service with his little book bag, along with Lois and Eunice, had his little watchtowers and wakes in there, walking along, taking doors, using that same presentation at the door that they had practiced with him Friday night. Now, what would have happened, or what happens with us when our children were at the book study, and they know the book study conductor has said, well, we want you to support the magazine work on Saturday. What happens if we as parents, at Saturday, you worked 5 days, and maybe you want to get a little rest. Be good to yourself. So you say, well, maybe I won't go out in service today. I'll get some sleep. And along about 10:30, you've got enough rest, you wake up and you decide to go out and cut the lawn. Get the weed eater out and put a good edge on the lawn there. Perhaps you're the mother and you say, well, maybe I'll go pick up some things from the mall, maybe get my hair. I won't have that problem fixed. But what are the children saying? They've heard the Christian teachings, but is your example consistent with the teachings that they have received? In other words, are you helping them to cope with the crisis? You see, our children learn from our example. Oftentimes we'll see a child and you have certain mannerisms. And we'll say, well, he inherited that from his father or mother. But is that really the case all of the time? You see, some mannerisms are learned mannerisms. It's often been found that even adopted children act and have mannerisms like their adopted parents. See? So we have to realize that when we're not even conscious of it, we're training our children. I'm very familiar with the situation of a very young boy who, while in kindergarten, following the instructions of his teacher, she told him to draw a picture of some things that the parents do around the house. Well, he did, and that evening he got home and he was very proud of the picture, so he showed it to his mother. Now, if you're familiar with kindergartners' art, they need some explanation. So the mother said, well, what is that, son? He showed it to her, and she said, well, that's a picture of you, Mom. And she said, well, what am I doing? She said, well, you're standing at the stove there baking a cake. He said, that's good, son. But what's that up there in the corner? He said, that's a picture of Dad. What's Dad doing? Well, he's lying on the couch drinking a beer. Well, now, did that father ever sit that son down and tell him that that's what fathers do while mothers work in the kitchen? No. The father had taught his son that through what? His example, through his actions. That father has to get his act together, or else his son's going to grow up thinking that that's what fathers do while mothers work in the kitchen. Yes, our example plays an important role in helping our children to cope with today's crisis. Another part, as we mentioned before, is teaching. It takes effort for parents to buy out time to spend with their children, and of course more is required than just simply being around them. We need to communicate with them effectively. You know, we can be in the room with our children watching TV, but can we really and truly say that we are interacting with them? We might turn to them every once in a while and briefly say something, but the children, they are interacting with what? The TV. Now, one of the best times for us to communicate and interact with our children, the faithful slave has said many times, is at the meal table. It has suggested several times that we as family members try to eat at least one meal per day together. There's something about eating. When you start eating together, you start talking with each other, and your children start to express themselves and tell you things that they wouldn't normally tell you. So that's very important that we put forth the effort to do that. And needless, we don't have to mention how important that family Bible study is. We need to make time for that family Bible study. And sometimes the children are of different ages. So we might have to break that family study up into several a week, perhaps 15 minutes per session. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that intellectual study that we have. That is where we take a question and throw it to our children, and they catch the question and throw us back an answer. There's various ways that we can teach our children. What about having a Bible drama that let the children act out different Bible characters? I'm sure we're all looking forward to the district convention next month, July 13th through the 15th. Now, one of the things that stands out in our mind about that as we look forward to that district convention is what? The drama. If we remember nothing about last year's convention, we remember what? The drama. So the same effect that drama has on us, the dramas in our family study will have on our young people. They could even draw little Bible characters. If they're old enough, have them to do research and then share it with the other members of the family there. You see, it's so important that we take the time. It's definitely a challenge to develop this family Bible study. But just like the parent, whoever it is that prepares meals within the family, they take out time to make sure that it's seasoned just right and that it's arranged and looks so good. Well, that's the same thing we have to do with our family study. What would happen if you as a parent was prepared a meal for your child, and you took a pot and you took 3 potatoes, chopped them up, put them in the pot, some water in the pot, some salt and pepper, a little butter, and you put that on the stove. How long you cook potatoes? 5-10 minutes? Put that on the stove, let it cook maybe 10 minutes, and then took it off and put it in your child's plate. Do you think your child would eat that? I doubt it very seriously. But if it was possible, if you could take that same potato out of that pot, wash all that salt, butter, and whatever else that was you put in there, put that potato back together and take it down here, I forget the name of this street, Route 92, was it? And take it in there to that little guy where they have those golden arches, to that guy behind the counter with the hat on backwards, and give that same potato to him, and he turns it into what? McDonald's French fries. And tell me your child wouldn't eat that potato then. Same potato, it's just that McDonald's knows how to deal with potatoes, you see. So what does that tell us about our family study? Simply put, we have to McDonaldize our family studies so that our children will be able to enjoy them. The same emphasis that we put on physical food, we have to do that on spiritual food. We have to remember that we're trying to put the mind of Jehovah into our children. Truly, loving parents will be more concerned about inculcating godly devotion than about children's secular education and material possessions. Yes, I'm sure when school is in and your children come in from school, one of the first things that you do is, well, you allow them to relax a little, but then you tell them to what? Start working on that, get on that homework, right? And of course, the homework is important. But how important is it? Notice what John chapter 17 and verse 3 says. And I don't want any young person here today to say that Brother Dorsey is implying that you don't have to do your homework. So listen clearly. John chapter 17 and verse 3 says this. This means everlasting life. They're taking in knowledge of you, the only true God, and the one whom you sent forth, Jesus Christ. Yes, the homework, the secular education is important, but the taking in knowledge of Jehovah God and Jesus Christ is much more important. That secular education will get you through this system of things, but that knowledge, that godly devotion, will give you everlasting life. Parents, we have to keep in mind 3 things, and that is that our children, they see what we do, they hear what we say, and they also sense how we feel. On the other hand, youth, you are the ones who are confronted with a crisis. So what can you do to cope with today's crisis? Well, young people, you have to practice godly devotion. You have to recognize who your enemy is. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 19 tells us that the whole world is lying in the power of the wicked one. You see, the devil will do anything to get you to break your relationship with Jehovah. There's no need for you to blame your parents who brought you in this world, because they're in the world along with you. Keeping in mind that Matthew chapter 7 and verse 13 and 14 talks about 2 roads. One is broad and spacious, leading off into destruction. One is narrow, that leads off into everlasting life. The majority of people on earth today are on that broad road leading off into destruction. And Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 says that you have to reap what you sow. And of course, that is what society is doing today. They're reaping the fruits of being on that broad road. We can see that by the articles that we mentioned before about the 14-year-old boy in Florida who had shot his teacher. So many children are being prostituted in Atlanta that the police are creating a special unit to identify child victims and build cases against the adults exploiting them. The girl's ex-principal and her were found in Vegas. 11-year-old girl thinks she's in love with a 28-year-old man who was arrested. The Doorville police arrested teens for the death of the 3-year-old. The teenagers that were shot and in southeast Atlanta about a marijuana. All of these are part of reaping what society has sown. So youth, you need to be able to resist Satan by practicing godly devotion. Have the moral fiber to resist sexual immorality. Notice what 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18 says. The first 3 or 4 words there will really make the point. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the first part of verse 18 says, flee from fornication. And there is no doubt in my mind that all young people here this afternoon would literally flee from fornication. All of us would. If someone walked up to any young person and says, let's commit fornication, what would you do, young people? Just turn around and run, right? Of course you would. But what about circumstances that lead to fornication? What about those? Sometimes they are not as clearly defined as someone asking you up front to commit fornication. For example, in dating and courting, the youth book, Your Youth Getting the Best Out of It, on page 149 says, properly, courting should be carried on with marriage as its goal. So you see, properly, within Jehovah's organization, the only way or only reason we date when we have marriage as our goal or as its goal. Now, of course, some young people will say, well, we're together, but this is a platonic relationship. Now, a platonic relationship is a relationship between male and female where there's no sex involved. It's interesting how the Young People Ask book on page 232 refers to that platonic relationship as being a so-called platonic relationship, implying that there's really no such thing as a platonic relationship. And that's true because that sexual attraction between male and female is one of the strongest attraction between male and females. Jehovah designed us that way. He designed us that way so that the human race would never, ever die off the face of the earth. So how do you stay away from that immoral act? It's like the last link in a chain, and the first link is when you touch hands or hold hands. See? So the way you stay away from the last link is you don't toy around with the first link. Because let's face it, if you're holding hands with somebody that you kind of feel a little something about, that's going to get old quickly. And then you want to do something else, right? Maybe put your arm on the seat that she's sitting in. Well, that arm will soon slip off around her. That gets old, and then you want to kind of pull her a little closer, right? And then what's happening when you're going down these links leading to that last link? Well, the body is getting itself all built up and ready for that last link. Now, some might reason, well, hey, listen, I can stop just before I get there. Well, you might think you can, but the body doesn't know that, you see. But let's say if you're able to stop at that last link before the last one, what happens then? Well, did you ever sit down for one of those good movies, a mystery, and you're sitting there and it comes down to the last 5 minutes, and then they have a commercial, so you're able to go around and get you some more popcorn, your favorite beverage, and get back and sitting on the center of the seat there, ready to see who did it. And all the points are coming together now, and you're about to figure it out, and you say, yeah, okay, I got this little tidbit over here, and I can put all this together. And just as you find out who did it, the lights goes out. What happened? You're frustrated, right? Well, the same thing happens when you're able to go all the way down to that link just before the last one, and you have to stop. So the way to keep from all this frustration and getting involved in that last link is to stop toying, not to toy around with the first link. You also need to be able to say no to the improper use of drugs. Jesus was able to do that. You recall on the night before he was going to die, he turned down the drugs because he knew that he had to make some very, very important decisions. And he wanted his clear thinking faculties there. See, and young people today, you are constantly making decisions as in your service to Jehovah. So you too need to be able to say no to the improper use of drugs. Yes, young people, you can reap a different harvest or rich reward by taking the initiative in doing God's will. You see, Jehovah offers freedom and a purposeful, happy life now and for those who serve him unselfishly throughout all of the future. You have freedom from religious bondage, worldly philosophies, and slavery to one's flesh. And there are thousands of young people coping with the crisis and living happy lives today. When you visit the world headquarters at Brooklyn, you see these youths there coping with the crisis. Why? Because they are working with a godly devotion. Right here in this congregation, I'm sure that there are many young people that are in the full-time service, ministerial servants, auxiliary pioneering from time to time, just coping with the crisis, devoted to Jehovah. Youth are doing this throughout God's system, or throughout God's association of brothers. I'm familiar with but I recall an example of a situation out on the West Coast some years back of a young 2.5-year-old girl. She had leukemia, and she got sick, and her blood count had dropped very, very low, and naturally they took her to the doctor, and the doctors said that she needed a transfusion. Now, the little girl had a mother, and at that time she did not have a husband. So these doctors, they got together, and they said, well, instead of getting a court order, and that's what they normally do, they said, well, what we'll do is we'll form a panel, and we'll bring this mother in, and surely we should be able to convince her that what we're trying to do for her is the proper thing. So these doctors, that's what they did. They got together there, they formed their panel, and they called the mother in. The mother came in along, and she brought her mother and the little 2.5-year-old girl. They were all three there together, and then here comes in the panel of doctors. And these doctors were grilling and drilling our dear sisters. And at the end, one got up and says, what right do you have to refuse this life-saving treatment for your daughter? She's not one of Jehovah's Witnesses. You are. And we understand that in later years, a lot of your children, they don't even want to be Jehovah's Witnesses. You see the argument that they're using. And here you're going to allow your daughter to die because you will not allow her to receive a transfusion. Well, the mother, she didn't know what to say. She didn't have the training that the hospital liaison committee has. So she looked at her grandmother. Well, the grandmother didn't know what to say either. So they were just silent. They just didn't know what to do in this situation. And then this little 2.5-year-old girl started to sing, "We are Jehovah's Witnesses," and just brought that panel of doctors to a complete silence. And from that situation came a doctor who was a pediatrician, oncologist, hematologist, and all those names there just confuses me. But he's a pediatrician, hematologist, he's a blood specialist, oncologist, was a specialist in cancer. And that's a heavy guy. And he said, I'll administer this chemotherapy without blood. But the point is that even that little 2.5-year-old girl did what? Maintain her integrity under such situations. You see, all youth today, you can do the same. And why do we say that? Well, we can say that because Jehovah is going to bring everlasting life to all of us, and he cannot lie. Titus chapter 1 and verse 1 tells us, of course, that. So we, young people, you should have confidence in his visible arrangement, support the meetings, and seek counsel of the elders. Notice what 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22 says. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22 says this, "So flee from the desires incidental to youth, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace, along with those who call upon the Lord out of a clean heart." Yes, don't look to the world for your guidance or for your role models. Look here in the congregation to the elders, the ministerial servants, the pioneers, your mature parents, you see. This is where that you can receive the instruction that you need. Preach the kingdom message, which makes Jehovah's heart rejoice. A wonderful, wonderful future awaits all upright youth. So in answer to the question, how can youth cope with today's crisis? Well, youth, you can cope with today's crisis by applying the information that we have talked about in the last 45 minutes. You can cope with today's crisis. But now, youth, let me leave you with this question, and that is, will you cope with with today's crisis.